They found them in the dark. 25 children breathing the same stale, rotting air beneath a Louisiana plantation in 1852, locked behind an iron door that had not been opened in years. When the soldiers forced it down, the crash echoed through the brick corridors like a verdict against history itself. They expected chains. They expected the familiar brutality of American slavery. They did not expect to see the mistress staring back at them through the faces of children. High cheekbones, pale green eyes, auburn hair threaded with gold. Features too deliberate to be a coincidence. The oldest girl, no more than 13, spoke only once. She says we are her legacy, not property, not servants. Legacy. Let that word settle into you. Because what happened in that basement was not chaos or secret passion gone wrong. It was designed, cold, systematic, intentional. A widow on failing land who looked at declining cotton yields and rising debt and chose not to surrender, but to manufacture loyalty through blood. She would not buy labor. She would breed permanence. Sons who would father children with enslaved women. Children who would resemble her. Generations bound not only by law, but by biology, by psychological confusion, by identity itself. Blood is capital. Genetics as ownership. A dynasty engineered inside the architecture of bondage. And here is what should disturb you most. The records are thin. Parish logs incomplete. County histories silent. Mentions are buried in military correspondence and then sealed. It is as if someone understood that this was not merely depravity. It was a method, and methods threaten institutions more than scandals ever could. You're not here because you enjoy horror. You're here because something in you recognizes the pattern. Power not only dominates the body, it rewrites lineage. It alters memory. It erases paper trails. It plants silence where truth should grow. This is not just a story about a plantation. It is about a mindset that saw human beings as clay and bloodlines as tools. And if you follow me further into this, you will begin to understand something far darker. Systems like this do not vanish. They evolve. The house may be gone. The iron door may have rusted away. But the logic behind it, the belief that control is strongest when it runs through blood and identity, never truly died. Stay with me, because once you see how deep this goes, you will never look at history the same way again. To understand how something like this could happen, you have to step into Louisiana in 1852, not the romanticized South of sweeping verandas and polished silver, but the raw, humid reality of a region built on exhaustion. The plantation sat miles from the nearest township, surrounded by swampland and fields that had been forced to produce cotton beyond their natural limits. The soil was thinning. Profits were shrinking. Creditors were circling. And at the center of it all stood a widow who refused to fall with the land. She had been educated, disciplined, raised to believe that status was not simply inherited, it was defended. When her husband died, he left her with debt, a fragile social standing, and two adolescent sons shaped more by entitlement than strength. She understood something they did not. Power does not survive by nostalgia. It adapts. While neighboring estates cut rations and sold off enslaved families to balance their books, she studied numbers, birth rates, market prices, labor projections. She recognized a brutal economic truth that few dared to say aloud. Purchasing enslaved labor was becoming expensive, but breeding it internally, that was an investment. Most plantations encouraged reproduction quietly, offering small privileges to enslaved couples. But her vision was different. She did not want random offspring. She wanted controlled lineage. Children who would carry her features. Children who would blur the psychological boundary between owner and owned. Because confusion is control. A child who sees their mistress in the mirror carries a different burden than one who does not. Identity fractures obedience and is something deeper than fear. It becomes an internalized hierarchy. And this is where her sons enter the story. Boys raised under rigid discipline, taught that family reputation was sacred, that obedience to their mother was survival. She did not present her plan as perversion. She framed it as preservation. Our blood must endure, she told them. The estate must remain ours in every sense. At first, they resisted. Then they rationalized. She invoked legacy, duty, divine order. She spoke the language of destiny. And slowly, the line between morality and obligation dissolved. This is how corruption works. It rarely storms the gates. It persuades from within. By the time the first child was born, the structure was already in place. The overseer kept silent. The midwife was paid generously. The enslaved women selected had no choice. The sons told themselves they were securing the family name. And the widow watched as her experiment began to breathe. What was forming in that plantation house was not chaos. It was an engineered bloodline. And once a system like that begins, it does not stop easily. The first child changed the atmosphere of the house. Not because of love, because of proof. When the infant's eyes opened weeks after birth, pale green, unmistakable, the widow knew her calculation had worked. Biology had done what law alone never could. The child did not merely belong to the plantation. The child reflected it, reflected her. That reflection was powerful. She did not completely hide the resemblance. She allowed whispers. She let certain servants notice. Not enough to spark rebellion, just enough to create psychological tension. Because tension destabilizes identity. And when identity destabilizes, authority strengthens. Think about that. If a child grows up knowing the master's blood runs through them, what does that do to their mind? They are not fully accepted by white society. They are not fully embraced within the enslaved quarters. They exist in between, dependent on the one person who controls both worlds. Dependence is stronger than chains. By the second year, there were 2 more children. Both bore variations of the same features. The sharp bone structure, the copper hair catching Louisiana sunlight. The sons had stopped resisting entirely. The widow's language had reshaped their conscience. She framed each birth as an expansion of influence, a multiplication of family presence across the land. You are planting permanence, she would say, but permanence built on moral, wrought as consequences. The enslaved community understood what was happening long before any outsider did. They saw who was summoned to the house. They counted pregnancies. They noticed which infants were kept closer to the main residence, fed slightly better, and dressed marginally finer. Division was intentional. Favor creates hierarchy. Hierarchy fragments solidarity. And fragmented people cannot unite. This was not just a breeding program. It was psychological architecture. She was redesigning the social structure of the plantation from the inside, ensuring that future generations would police themselves through confusion and competition. Some of the enslaved men felt rage. Others felt helpless calculation. Open resistance meant death. Quiet endurance meant survival. And survival, under such a system, meant watching your own blood become entangled in a lineage engineered for control. By the 5th year, there were 7 children. The widow kept meticulous records, not sentimental entries, but diagrams, traits, pairings, predictions for the next decade. She believed she was refining something, improving obedience through inherited proximity to power. But what she failed to understand was this: blood does not guarantee loyalty. It magnifies tension, and tension, when suppressed long enough, turns volatile. The plantation looked calm from the road. White columns, still fields, smoke curling from chimneys. But beneath that surface, something unstable was growing, not just in the basement nursery, not just in the ledgers, but in the minds of everyone forced to participate. And once instability reaches a critical mass, it does not stay contained. It explodes. By the 8th year, the plantation no longer felt like a failing estate. It felt like a controlled experiment. The widow had refined her methods. Births were timed strategically to avoid suspicion. The local priest was told that several infants had been sent to relatives upriver. The midwife was rewarded with land parcels discreetly transferred through intermediaries. Paper trails were diluted. Conversations were coded. Silence became currency. But the real evolution was not logistical. It was psychological. The children were not raised entirely in the quarters, nor entirely in the main house. They existed in a carefully managed middle ground, allowed to learn basic literacy, permitted access to certain areas of the estate, forbidden to others, given just enough privilege to feel distinct, but never enough to feel free. This is how hierarchy cements itself. Give a man a taste of elevation, and he will defend the structure that grants it. The eldest of the children, now approaching adolescence, had begun asking questions. Why do we look like her? Why are we treated differently? Why are we told we are both family and property? The widow anticipated this. She gathered them in small groups and spoke in measured tones about destiny. She told them they were chosen to preserve something greater, that their bloodline was proof of divine design, that loyalty would ensure protection. She did not rule through cruelty alone. She ruled through narrative. And narrative is more powerful than force. Meanwhile, her sons were changing. What began as reluctant participation had transformed into something darker: entitlement. They saw the children not as contradictions, but as extensions of their own dominance. The moral hesitation that once flickered in their eyes had been extinguished by repetition. Exposure desensitizes. Repetition normalizes. Normalization builds systems. But outside the plantation gates, America was shifting. Tensions over slavery were tightening like a drawn wire. Newspapers whispered of abolitionist movements. Political debates grew sharper. The air carried a sense of approaching fracture. Inside the estate, however, the widow felt insulated. She believed her creation was untouchable because it was self-contained. No auctions, no outside purchases, no visible scandal. She mistook secrecy for security. What she could not see or refuse to was the psychological damage compounding beneath her design. The enslaved community carried silent resentment. The hybrid children carried identity fractures. Even her sons carried an unspoken corrosion of conscience. And when systems are built on fractured minds, they become unstable under pressure. Pressure was coming. War does not simply involve clashing armies. It exposes hidden rot. And the rot beneath that plantation was deeper than anyone beyond its gates could imagine. War did not arrive at the plantation as thunder. It arrived as a rumor. Whispers carried along riverboats. Newspaper scraps folded into coat pockets. Names like secession, union, abolition, words that felt distant at first, like storms forming beyond the horizon. The widow dismissed them publicly. Politics is theater, she would say at dinner, her voice calm, controlled. Land endures. But privately, she began recalculating, because war threatens systems that depend on silence. By 1861, the estate had changed in ways no outsider could measure. 12 children now moved between the main house and the quarters, their resemblance impossible to ignore for anyone who lingered long enough. The eldest boy had begun working in the fields under supervision, not as a common laborer, but as something else, an overseer in training. Do you see the shift? She was not merely breeding labor. She was breeding enforcers. Children who carried her blood would one day manage those who did not. The confusion of identity would turn into hierarchy. Those closest to power would defend it hardest. It was a self-repairing structure, designed to survive external threats. That is how sophisticated control works. It does not rely only on force from above. It manufactures loyalty from within. As Confederate banners rose across Louisiana, the widow adjusted again. Records were burned. Certain pages of her ledgers disappeared into the fireplace at midnight. The midwife was sent away under the guise of illness. The sons were told that if Union troops ever reached the parish, they were to deny everything. The children were to be hidden. Hidden, not freed, not protected. Hidden because they were not family in her eyes. They were assets. Meanwhile, the enslaved community sensed something shifting. War created cracks in certainty. If the Confederacy fell, what would happen to them? Would freedom come? Would retribution follow? And what of the children who stood between categories, neither fully enslaved in appearance nor fully accepted by white society? Some whispered that the widow feared not abolition, but exposure, because emancipation would not simply free labor. It would unravel lineage. Questions would surface. Faces would be examined. Bloodlines would be traced. And blood leaves evidence. The eldest girl, the one who would later speak to soldiers, had begun to understand more than the widow intended. She listened at doors. She noticed which portraits hung in the hallway and which had been removed. She studied her own reflection longer each year. Identity cannot be suppressed forever. It either collapses inward or it demands truth. By 1863, Union forces were pushing deeper into the South. Plantation owners fled westward or fortified their estates. The widow did neither. She believed her greatest weapon was invisibility. But invisibility is fragile when built on deception, because once a single door is forced open, darkness cannot defend itself. The year 1864 did not knock politely. It tore through Louisiana like a blade. Union patrols moved along the river corridors, confiscating supplies, dismantling Confederate strongholds, and documenting what they found. Plantations that had once projected invincibility now stood exposed, their columns cracked, their owners anxious, their illusions thinning. The widow felt it before she saw it. Not fear, pressure. Pressure against a structure she had spent 16 years constructing. Her sons argued for evacuation. "We can ride west," the eldest insisted. "Take what we can carry. Leave the rest." But she refused. Abandoning the estate meant surrendering the experiment. It meant admitting that blood alone could not anchor power. Instead, she implemented the final phase of concealment. The children were moved beneath the house. The basement had once stored tools, and preserved meats. Now it has become a vault for lineage. Cots were arranged in rows. Lanterns were rationed. Food was delivered at night through servants sworn to silence by fear or loyalty. The eldest children were instructed to keep the younger ones quiet. They were told this was temporary, a test of devotion. Imagine the psychology of that moment. Children who had been raised half-privileged, half-enslaved, told they were chosen, suddenly hidden like contraband. The narrative began to fracture. Destiny felt less divine in the dark. Above them, the plantation continued its performance of normalcy. The widow received visitors with poise. She spoke of crops and weather. She insisted her sons were loyal to the Confederacy. She burned the last of her detailed breeding charts in the fireplace, watching the ink curl into ash. But you cannot burn faces. You cannot erase resemblance. And war has a way of uncovering what peace allows to hide. When Union soldiers finally reached the parish, it was not a dramatic siege. It was methodical. They moved from property to property, searching for weapons, confiscating documents, and cataloging enslaved individuals for federal records. At first, the widow believed she could outmaneuver them with charm. She had practiced authority for decades. She understood posture, tone, eye contact, but control built on isolation weakens under scrutiny. A young officer noticed something unusual in the household count. The numbers did not align with parish records. A servant, frightened and exhausted, hesitated when questioned about the basement. Hesitation is louder than confession. And then came the sound of iron being struck. The door had not been opened in weeks. When it finally gave way, light flooded into a space that had been engineered for secrecy. And what the soldiers saw was not chaos. It was uniformity. 25 children. Same bone structure. Same eyes. Same silence. That silence carried more accusation than any testimony ever could. In that moment, the widow's system collapsed. Not because it lacked logic, but because it could not survive visibility. And here is the truth you must confront. Most systems of control do not fear rebellion. They fear exposure. Because once exposed, even the most carefully engineered bloodline becomes evidence. And evidence changes history. When the soldiers stepped fully into the basement, the air shifted. It was not just the smell of damp brick and unwashed bodies. It was recognition. Even men hardened by battlefield carnage paused when they saw the children's faces. War had shown them amputations, mass graves, cities burning. But this was different. This was deliberate cultivation. One lantern lifted higher. Light caught auburn strands of hair. Green eyes reflected flame. The youngest clung to the oldest, instinctively arranged, almost disciplined in their silence. They had been trained not to cry out, trained not to speak unless commanded. That kind of silence is not natural. It is conditioned. The officer in charge asked a simple question. "Who are your parents?" The 13-year-old girl answered, "Our mother is upstairs." Not mistress, not the owner. Mother. The word hit harder than any confession. Upstairs, the widow maintained composure. When confronted, she did not scream. She did not faint. She adjusted her gloves and corrected the officer's tone. She insisted the children were distant relations, orphans taken in out of charity. "You misunderstand Southern responsibility," she said evenly. But resemblance is a ruthless witness. The soldiers separated the children briefly, asking questions in private. Stories aligned too cleanly. The same phrases repeated. "We are her legacy. We must stay loyal. Our blood belongs here." Belongs. understand the depth of that conditioning. They were not simply hidden to avoid discovery. They had been psychologically shaped to defend the very structure that imprisoned them. This is the genius and the horror of long-term control. When identity is manipulated early enough, loyalty feels voluntary. The sons stood nearby, pale, sweating beneath Confederate gray. They avoided eye contact. For the first time in years, they were not extensions of power. They were suspects. One of the younger children began to cry when taken upstairs in a full daylight. The brightness hurt their eyes. Think about that. They had lived so long beneath concealment that sunlight felt foreign. Freedom often does. By evening, the plantation was no longer an estate. It was a scene under investigation. Notes were taken, names recorded, physical descriptions written with uncomfortable detail. But here is what history rarely tells you. Documentation does not guarantee justice. The war was still raging. Resources were thin. Priorities were military, not moral. The widow was detained briefly, questioned, but not immediately imprisoned. There were no modern forensic tools, no DNA testing, only testimony and resemblance. And resemblance, while powerful, could be dismissed by those who benefit from doubt. The children were transported away for processing under Union authority. Some were placed in freedmen's camps. Some vanished into overcrowded systems already overwhelmed by emancipation. Fragmentation began immediately. The very unity she had engineered dissolved under bureaucratic strain. And this is where the story turns from exposure to something darker. Because systems rarely collapse cleanly. They mutate. The widow's plantation fell under federal control. But the ideas behind her experiment did not die with the estate. They lingered in whispered strategies, in private conversations about blood and loyalty, in the understanding that control is strongest when it reshapes identity itself. You might think this is where justice enters. It isn't. This is where adaptation begins. After the soldiers left, the plantation did not burn. It stood, columns intact, walls upright, fields still stretching into the Louisiana heat as if nothing unnatural had happened beneath them. That is how corruption survives. It rarely announces its crimes with flames. It simply absorbs shock and waits. The widow was never publicly tried for what she engineered. The war consumed attention. Reconstruction consumed resources. Legal systems in the South were collapsing and reforming at the same time. In chaos, precision crimes blur. She claimed benevolence. She claimed protection. She claimed maternal instinct in a time of instability. Without written proof, most of which she had already destroyed, accusations thinned into rumor. And rumor does not convict the powerful. Her sons returned months later under altered circumstances. The Confederacy had fallen. The old hierarchy was fractured. But fractured systems do not vanish. They reorganize. They learned quickly how to adjust their language. The word ownership was replaced with employment. The word breeding was replaced with caretaking. The narrative shifted. Always watch the language, because language is the camouflage of power. The children who had been taken from the basement were scattered. Some were placed into labor contracts under new post-war policies. Some absorbed into communities of freed people struggling to survive. And some, the ones whose features drew attention, were quietly redirected, absorbed into households where resemblance could be hidden more easily. Identity dissolved into paperwork. Think about that. When documentation controls destiny, erasure becomes a weapon. The widow understood something profound about human systems. Legality is fluid, but psychology endures. Even without formal authority, she had already planted an idea that blood proximity to power creates internal hierarchy. And that idea outlived her estate. Years later, observers would note unusual patterns in nearby parishes. Lighter-skinned laborers occupy intermediary positions. Families whose lineage traced back ambiguously to a plantation no one liked to discuss. Stories half-spoken around dinner tables, cut short when children enter the room. Silence is generational. And here is where I need you to pay attention, not as a passive listener, but as a man confronting a pattern. Control is most effective when it makes people complicit in defending their own cage. The children were told they were chosen. The sons were told they were preserving the legacy. The enslaved community was divided by selective privilege. Every layer reinforced the structure. That logic did not disappear in 1865. It evolved. Halfway through this descent, I want you to mark this moment. If you understand what this story is really about, not just a plantation, but engineered loyalty, I want you to write this phrase in the comments: blood remembers. Write it once, then write it again. Not for superstition, not for theatrics, but as a signal to yourself that you recognize how power embeds itself beneath identity. Because from here forward, we are no longer just examining history. We are dissecting a blueprint. And once you see the blueprint clearly, you begin to recognize it everywhere. The aftermath of exposure did not bring clarity. It brought mutation. The widow's system, once centralized in the main house and basement, had dispersed, but the mechanisms remained embedded in everyone who had lived under her roof. Her sons, now young men, carried the lessons of obedience, manipulation, and silent enforcement. They had witnessed the consolidation of power through biology and fear, and though they escaped immediate punishment, their moral compass had been fractured beyond repair. They understood that survival depended not on right or wrong, but on perception, narrative, and loyalty to blood over justice. Meanwhile, the children who had been removed from the basement were scattered across freedmen's camps, orphanages, and the homes of sympathetic families. Yet their upbringing had already encoded patterns of thought: respect for hierarchy, internalization of authority, and the strange loyalty that comes from being told you are chosen while being treated as property. They were children of the plantation's experiment, carrying both trauma and the unspoken creed of obedience. Many of them grew up never fully understanding their own origins, yet unconsciously replicating the psychological architecture that had shaped them. The widow herself vanished from historical records after a few years. Some accounts claim she remarried, moving quietly to a neighboring parish. Others suggest she died in obscurity, her estate quietly sold to settle debts. But death does not erase influence. Her methods, her designs, and her ideology. The notion that identity can be manipulated, loyalty engineered, and bloodline weaponized outlived her physical presence. It seeped into local culture, whispered through generations, leaving traces that only a careful observer could detect. Consider this. The plantation may have fallen under Union oversight, but what survived was the human network she had shaped. The sons carried lessons of control and secrecy. The children carried obedience molded into instinct. The community carried a memory of divided allegiances. Her system was no longer centralized, yet its essence had multiplied distributed across people who would continue to act according to patterns she had meticulously designed. And here lies the dangerous truth. Power rooted in identity and blood is invisible to the casual observer. It does not require force once internalized. It becomes self-sustaining. The seed she planted in flesh, mind, and psyche spread quietly, imperceptibly, until generations later they manifested in behaviors, allegiances, and hierarchies that no law, no moral outrage could fully eradicate. This is the lesson most history books omit. Control does not always collapse with exposure. Sometimes it evolves, spreading into every corner of society, carried silently by those who survived it. And when you understand that, you start seeing the hidden architectures of power, the ones that operate beneath the surface, shaping people without them ever realizing it. By the late 1860s, the remnants of the plantation's experiment had woven themselves into the social fabric in ways few could trace. The widow's sons had matured into men, their worldview sharpened by years of observing her methods. They understood that power is maintained not just through property or violence, but through psychological conditioning, secrecy, and subtle reinforcement. They carried with them an almost instinctive ability to assess loyalty, manipulate perception, and exploit fear, tools they had inherited as surely as land or wealth. The children, now scattered, were living paradoxical lives. Some had been absorbed into communities of freed people, learning freedom while carrying the residue of obedience instilled beneath the plantation's roof. Others were placed in households where resemblance could be hidden, forced into identities that were not theirs. And in all cases, they bore an internalized hierarchy, a sense that some were chosen and others were lesser, even if no one explained why. Trauma had a blueprint, and it left invisible marks. Observe carefully. This is where history and psychology intersect. When control is coded into identity, it transcends legality. The law may declare freedom, but the mind does not immediately follow. Obedience, loyalty, and fear can persist, quietly shaping choices for decades. It is why some individuals who emerge from oppression still uphold structures that once enslaved them. They are not consciously complicit. They are conditioned to reproduce patterns because patterns feel safe, familiar, and inevitable. The widow's journal, destroyed or hidden, could have revealed the full horror of her calculations. But even without it, the evidence lived in flesh and mind. Generations later, those who bore her blood, directly or indirectly, carried subtle markers, confidence in domination, an innate sense of hierarchy, an unconscious allegiance to structures that rewarded conformity and punished dissent. Even her biological descendants, integrated into a free society, retained traces of her psychological engineering. And here's the crucial insight for anyone studying power. Systems built on identity and perception do not require visibility to function. They do not rely on written law, contracts, or threats. They operate quietly in habits, instincts, and unspoken codes. The widow understood this instinctively, and it is why her experiment, though exposed, continued to ripple outward. Now, as you listen to this, consider the patterns in your own world. Where do you see obedience cultivated silently? Where do you see loyalty manufactured through selective privilege? Recognizing these mechanisms is the first step in understanding the invisible networks that govern human behavior. the hidden forces that shape societies long after the original architect is gone. And as we descend further into this story, remember, history is never just about what is recorded. It is about what endures in the minds and systems of those who survive it. This is the lesson the widow taught, a lesson that continues to echo silently in every structure built upon control. By the 1870s, whispers of the widow's methods had become folklore, half-remembered stories passed cautiously from neighbor to neighbor. Some dismissed them as exaggerations, ghost tales to frighten children. Others, those with sharper observation or familial memory, knew better. They remembered the odd privileges granted to certain laborers, the way some families seemed to hold authority disproportionate to wealth or skill, and the uncanny resemblance in features that refused to be explained away. These subtleties were her enduring signature, proof that control does not always require visible chains. Consider the sons. Now adults, they were embedded in the local economy and social hierarchy. The eldest had inherited subtle authority, commanding respect not through force alone, but through the aura of legacy. He understood human behavior intimately, which words compelled compliance, which gestures elicited deference, which silences could fracture community trust. He had been trained in power by living under a mother who treated loyalty like a currency, obedience like a sacred law. And even without her presence, her lessons persisted. Meanwhile, the children who survived dispersal were navigating a new America, one in which legal freedom existed, but social systems lagged behind. Their internalized hierarchy, conditioned obedience, and acute awareness of authority made them simultaneously resilient and vulnerable. Some found success, leveraging the subtle instincts implanted by years of manipulation. Others struggled, haunted by a sense of obligation to an authority they could no longer see, yet could not shake. The psychological architecture remained intact, whispering in the recesses of their minds. Here is the unspoken truth. Power designed to embed itself within identity rarely disappears. Laws may change, governments may fall, even revolutions can fail to dismantle it entirely. Because when influence resides in thought patterns, habits, and perception, it is nearly impossible to eradicate. The widow's experiment, though confined to a single plantation and a handful of bloodlines, became a microcosm of this principle. Her methods demonstrated that mastery over people can be achieved by shaping their perception of themselves, of loyalty, and of obligation. Now, reflect. Systems that endure invisibly are far more dangerous than those enforced by violence. One does not see the invisible chains until they begin to guide choices subtly, predictably. This is why the true architects of control rarely need armies. They require understanding of psychology, timing, and identity. And here is a warning embedded in history itself. When you encounter loyalty manufactured through fear, privilege, or identity, pause, observe, dissect, because these patterns, once recognized, reveal the architecture of power that shapes entire generations, often without anyone even noticing. By this point, the lesson becomes clear. The story is no longer about a plantation. It is about the mechanics of control, the replication of influence, and the quiet endurance of psychological systems that outlast their creators. As the decades passed, the plantation's shadow extended far beyond its original boundaries. The widow's direct influence faded from living memory, but the system she had installed, subtle, insidious and psychological, continued to propagate through those she had touched. Her sons inherited not just property or a name, but a framework for manipulating human behavior. They knew instinctively how to enforce loyalty without force, how to reward selectively, and how to make obedience feel voluntary. This was not learned. It had been encoded through years of observation, fear, and the careful calibration of relationships. The dispersed children carried a different inheritance. Some became caretakers, some laborers, some community intermediaries. Regardless of their paths, the imprint of the plantation lingered in their psyches. Obedience as identity, hierarchy as default, loyalty as obligation. They had been trained to defend a system that had imprisoned them, to see belonging in submission, to internalize control as a virtue. And because humans naturally replicate learned behavior, these patterns spread further through families, neighbors, and local institutions, like an invisible contagion. Observe closely. The widow's plan was never about immediate control alone. It was about embedding power into the subconscious. By conditioning identity, she created a system that could endure even in her absence. Legal emancipation could not touch it. Social upheaval could not dismantle it. The loyalty she manufactured was internalized, self-reinforcing, and adaptable. Even those who were free in law remained prisoners in the architecture of their minds. This is the principle most overlooked by historians. Exposure does not always equal eradication. Systems designed to manipulate identity and perception can survive scrutiny, bureaucracy, and even revolution. The widow's design had been simple yet brutal. She ensured that her influence would propagate invisibly through heredity, habit, and instinct. Every decision she made reinforced a network that operated below the surface, imperceptible but potent. Now, as you listen, consider this. How often in history and in your own life does influence operate invisibly? Where do patterns of obedience and allegiance persist even when authority is gone? Where do subtle rewards and punishments mold behavior without your conscious awareness? These are the structures of power that endure. They are the systems that shape society long after the architect has vanished. And here's the lesson you must internalize. Understanding these invisible architectures is dangerous knowledge. Once you see them, you cannot unsee them. You recognize the methods of control, the mechanisms of loyalty, and the silent forces that shape human behavior. You begin to see the world not as it is presented, but as it has been engineered. One mind, one family, one system at a time. By the turn of the century, whispers of the widow's methods had become muted echoes, yet they persisted in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Local families, historians, and even genealogists noticed patterns that could not be explained by chance. Certain traits appearing repeatedly, individuals occupying positions of trust and influence disproportionately, and loyalty that seemed instinctive rather than earned. These were the echoes of an experiment in human engineering, surviving long after its architect had disappeared. The widow had understood what few in her era, or any era, ever truly grasped. That power embedded in identity is stronger than any law, more enduring than any army, and more difficult to erase than any record. Her sons became quiet authorities within their own spheres. They were respected without question, not because of wealth or titles, but because they radiated the lessons learned from living under their mother's calculated gaze. Observation had become instinct. Fear had become strategy. The ability to manipulate perception, to reward subtly and punish invisibly, had been honed through years of intimate apprenticeship in psychological control. They understood the principle she had enforced so methodically. Obedience need not be demanded when it is ingrained. The children scattered across the post-war South carried invisible chains. They bore knowledge they did not consciously recognize. Who to trust, who to fear, when to conform, when to resist. They were living proofs of conditioning that could survive freedom, survive trauma, survive social upheaval. Many of them, unknowingly, replicated the very systems that had once bound them. Privilege, influence, and obedience became coded into their daily interactions, into how they raised their own families, and into the communities they shaped. Notice this. The widow's experiment demonstrates a chilling principle of human systems. Control is most effective when it is internalized. When people defend their own cages without realizing it, the power of the architect persists long after the physical structures crumble. Her methods were not brute force. They were architectural, psychological, and subtle. That is why history rarely acknowledges them. Visible horrors are shocking. Invisible ones endure. And now, as you absorb this, consider the implications. Systems of control, whether in families, governments, corporations, or secret societies, often operate like hers. They rely on identity, on internalized loyalty, on the quiet shaping of perception over years. This is not a theory. It is a blueprint repeated across history, in shadows you may have walked past without seeing. Recognizing it is the first step toward mastery, the first step toward understanding power as it truly operates, silent, invisible, unstoppable. By this stage, understand that the story is no longer about a single plantation or a single woman. It is about the enduring mechanics of influence and the subtle, terrifying ways it can shape generations. By the 1910s, the physical traces of the plantation were fading into memory, yet the widow's influence had metastasized into ways no brick or beam could contain. The children she had engineered, now adults themselves, were quietly occupying positions of subtle authority within their communities. Some became teachers, some small business owners, some intermediaries between the newly freed and the still dominant white families of the South. Their power was imperceptible but tangible. Respect followed them. Deference came naturally, and loyalty was instinctively extended to those who mirrored the hierarchies they had been conditioned to uphold. Her sons had established themselves as quiet enforcers of this legacy. They understood that domination need not be overt. It was more effective to operate through suggestion, through influence, and through the perception that authority was inherent, natural, and deserved. Years of observing their mother's calculated manipulation had left them with an almost preternatural ability to predict human behavior, to exploit weakness, and to reinforce obedience without needing to issue a command. Every gesture, every word, every social cue became a tool in their arsenal. Meanwhile, the descendants of the children scattered after emancipation were unknowingly reproducing the plantation's invisible architecture. Families that had once been marked by proximity to her experiment now carried subtle markers of social strategy. Acute perception, careful self-censorship, and the instinctive knowledge of when to submit and when to assert. This was no mere cultural adaptation. It was the residue of psychological conditioning, passed down through generations like a genetic echo of control. Take a moment to recognize the larger truth here. Power survives best when it is internalized. Systems that imprint themselves on identity, on perception, and on instinct endure far longer than laws, armies, or written records. The widow had demonstrated this empirically. She had created a hierarchy bound not by property, but by the mind itself. The legacy of such systems is difficult to trace and even harder to dismantle because it does not leave obvious evidence. It thrives in habits, in assumptions, and in the unconscious choices of those who believe they are free. Now, as you listen, I want you to consider the hidden patterns in the world around you. How often do you encounter influence that shapes behavior without visible enforcement? Where do loyalty, obedience, or fear operate quietly, guiding decisions while remaining almost invisible? This is the lesson her story imparts. Understanding the architecture of invisible power is not just history, it is a tool. It is a lens through which you can recognize the forces that shape human behavior, long after their originators have vanished. And this is where the descent deepens. You are no longer a passive observer of history. You are beginning to see the subtle mechanics of control, the way influence persists, adapts, and embeds itself, forever imperceptible, yet profoundly effective. By the 1920s, the widow's legacy had fully transcended the physical plantation. The estate itself had been divided, sold, and repurposed. Fields lay fallow or converted to other crops, the house remodeled or abandoned. But the human architecture she had designed endured, scattered across towns and parishes, encoded in families and in social hierarchies invisible to outsiders. Her descendants, and the descendants of those she had conditioned, now carried a form of authority that needed no proclamation. They wielded influence not through law, money, or violence, but through instinct, perception, and inherited behavioral codes that replicated her control with precision. Her sons, trained in the subtle manipulation of loyalty and perception, continued to thrive quietly. Their skills were honed into a craft, observing weakness, exploiting trust, and ensuring compliance without ever needing to demand it. Authority had become a natural extension of their behavior. And because humans naturally follow those who seem chosen, respect and obedience were granted automatically. The widow had shown them the ultimate lesson: power that is internalized is permanent. The children scattered after emancipation were less visible, yet equally influential in their own spheres. They became teachers, clerks, tradesmen, and intermediaries, carrying within them a sense of hierarchy, obedience, and loyalty that had been impressed upon them like a watermark. Even in freedom, they continued to replicate the pattern she had designed, unknowingly perpetuating a system of psychological control that stretched beyond the plantation. The lessons of identity, privilege, and allegiance had become second nature. Here lies the stark truth. Influence that embeds itself in the human mind is far more durable than influence enforced externally. Structures of control survive when they shape perception and identity, when obedience is internalized, and when loyalty is programmed through subtle rewards and penalties. History often misleads us by focusing on visible events, wars, legislation, revolutions, while ignoring the underlying architecture of power that persists quietly, reshaping generations. Now, as you follow this descent, reflect on a critical point. Control is most dangerous when invisible, when accepted as normal, when internalized without awareness. Systems like this continue to operate, often without names, records, or accusations. Yet they mold behavior, direct social hierarchies, and perpetuate cycles of dominance and submission. The widow's experiment may have begun in a single Louisiana estate, but its blueprint echoes in every network where authority operates through psychology, identity, and perception. And here, I ask you again to mark your awareness. Write in the comments. Blood remembers. Write it twice, not as repetition, but as acknowledgement, as a signal that you see beyond the visible, that you understand how control persists when it is embedded in identity, and that you're beginning to see the world as it has been engineered. This is the point where history becomes a lens and observation becomes power. By the 1930s, the true horror of the widow's design was no longer secret. It had simply become invisible. Physical traces of the plantation had vanished, buried beneath new roads, towns, and forgotten fields. But the psychological infrastructure she had created endured, more potent, because it no longer needed supervision. Her sons, now adults fully versed in manipulation, wielded authority like a shadow, shaping communities without overt force. They understood what she had known all along. Control that exists in the mind outlives chains, laws, and walls. Obedience, internalized, becomes its own engine, silent yet unstoppable. The descendants of the scattered children, dispersed across towns and parishes, now carried within them instincts and behaviors they could not articulate. They had been taught unconsciously how to navigate hierarchies, how to measure loyalty, how to obey without question, and how to assert authority without appearing threatening. These lessons, coded into identity and reinforced by subtle privileges and punishments, were inherited as surely as bloodlines themselves. The plantation's reach had multiplied, extending invisibly into the social structures of post-war Louisiana. Consider this. Power that manipulates identity does not announce itself. It works through perception, shaping habits, intuition, and assumptions. The widow had built a system that no law could dismantle, a structure that survived emancipation and the upheavals of Reconstruction because it existed in the minds of those she had conditioned. And these invisible forces ripple outward, influencing communities, reinforcing hierarchies, and teaching subsequent generations without a single overt command. The subtlety of this control is the genius and the terror of her design. The plantation had been a laboratory, and its human subjects had become vectors, carrying behavioral programming far beyond the boundaries of Thornhill Estate. Authority, obedience, and loyalty were no longer enforced. They were instinctual. Every interaction, every decision, every gesture of compliance became a silent testament to her influence. Even freedom could not erase it. Now, pause and consider the implications for today. How often do invisible systems guide behavior? How often does allegiance, obedience, or hierarchy appear natural when it has been carefully engineered over decades? Recognizing these patterns is not casual curiosity. It is a form of mastery. It is seeing beneath the surface of history, society, and even personal relationships. And once more, mark your awareness. Write in the comments twice. Blood remembers. This is no empty phrase. It is a recognition that identity can be shaped, loyalty can be engineered, and control can persist far beyond the sight of the casual observer. It is a key to seeing power for what it truly is: hidden, enduring, and psychologically precise. By the 1940s, the plantation itself had faded from maps and memory, but its human architecture had only grown more insidious. The widow's sons had become silent arbiters of influence within their communities, moving through social and economic networks with a certainty born of years of observation and manipulation. They understood the mechanics of obedience and loyalty better than any lawman or politician, for they had been trained in the subtleties of fear, reward, and perception from their earliest years. Power, they realized, was not seized with violence. It was cultivated in the mind, nurtured invisibly, and enforced subtly. The descendants of the original children, now adults in their own right, carried the invisible imprint of the plantation's psychological conditioning. Their lives are guided by instincts that felt innate: who to trust, who to fear, when to submit, when to assert dominance. These instincts have been encoded into them through years of observation, privilege, and punishment carefully meted out under the guise of routine. Freedom had not erased the training. It had only scattered the vectors, embedding the widow's influence across families, towns, and parishes in ways that no law could trace. This is the disturbing principle at work. Influence that manipulates identity is self-perpetuating. Systems that operate through perception, habit, and internalized hierarchy do not require oversight to survive. They endure precisely because they are invisible. The widow's plantation had become more than a location. It had become a method, a blueprint for control that could outlast centuries. Those who carried her legacy often did so unknowingly, replicating patterns of authority, compliance, and loyalty without conscious intent. Unaware, they were part of a web far larger than themselves. Look closely, and you begin to see the deeper truth. True power is silent. It does not need armies, law books, or overt authority. It resides in identity, perception, and subconscious obedience. Those who control these elements can shape entire generations. Their influence invisible, their reach almost limitless. The widow's genius was that she understood this principle intuitively, and she engineered it with precision. Now, reflect on what this means in your world. Systems of control, political, social, even corporate, often operate with the same invisible precision. Obedience, loyalty, and hierarchy are taught, internalized, and perpetuated through subtle reinforcement. Recognizing these patterns is dangerous knowledge, because once you see them, you can never truly ignore them. History is no longer about a single plantation or a single woman. It is about the architecture of influence, the silent replication of control, and the invisible forces that shape generations long after the architect is gone. Understanding this is not optional. It is a necessity for anyone who seeks to see power as it truly operates. By the 1950s, the plantation had become nothing more than a faded memory in local archives. Yet the widow's design had metastasized into the social and psychological fabric of the region. Her sons, now middle-aged men, had perfected the lessons their mother had instilled in them. The subtle calibration of authority, the management of loyalty, and the manipulation of perception. They no longer needed to command obedience. It flowed naturally from those who recognized, consciously or not, the aura of control they radiated. Every glance, every word, every carefully timed gesture was a tool of influence, honed over decades of living in the shadow of a master manipulator. The descendants of the original children had, by now, fully internalized the invisible hierarchies embedded in their upbringing. Their instincts guided them with uncanny precision: when to defer, when to assert, when to speak, and when to remain silent. These were not conscious strategies. They were automatic responses, psychological programming inherited through observation, selective privilege, and carefully constructed reward systems. Even in the face of legal freedom, social upheaval, and the rapid modernization of the South, the architecture of control endured. It had transcended property, laws, and time, living instead in the minds and behaviors of those it had touched. This is the essence of the widow's method. Control that operates invisibly is nearly indestructible. Visible power is fragile. It can be overthrown, legislated away, or destroyed. Invisible power, embedded in identity, perception, and habit, survives everything. Her experiment proved that mastery over people does not require overt force. Only a deep understanding of psychology, loyalty, and obedience. Generations learned the rules without ever realizing they were being taught, and the system perpetuated itself silently, invisibly, and efficiently. Now consider what this reveals about history and the world around you. Systems of influence often operate beneath perception, shaping behavior and outcomes long before anyone realizes what is happening. They use identity, fear, and reward to anchor compliance, and they replicate themselves quietly through habit and observation. Recognizing these invisible structures is not mere curiosity. It is the first step toward understanding power in its truest, most dangerous form. And as you absorb this, remember, influence embedded in the human mind is more enduring than walls, armies, or laws. The widow's experiment may have begun in a single Louisiana estate, but its lessons echo across time, teaching us that true control is never just external. It is internal, perpetual, and invisible. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it, and the world you thought you understood begins to reveal itself in ways that are as fascinating as they are unsettling. By the 1960s, the physical remnants of the plantation had all but disappeared. Paint peeled from the old mansion. The fields lay fallow, and the outbuildings had collapsed into ruin. Yet the widow's design endured, stronger than stone or timber could ever be. Her sons, now men of influence in their own right, had internalized her lessons so completely that manipulation had become instinct. He could read a person's intentions at a glance, anticipate desires before they were spoken, and enforce loyalty without a single command. They understood a terrifying truth. When obedience is internalized, it is more enduring than any law or army. The descendants of the original children had long become silent carriers of the widow's system. Families had unknowingly absorbed the hierarchies, instincts, and behavioral codes embedded in them, guiding their choices, relationships, and communities. Obedience was no longer imposed. It was instinctive. Loyalty was no longer coerced. It was self-enforced. Even those who believed they were free were, in subtle ways, operating within a structure the widow had designed decades earlier. It was a legacy written not on paper, but into the mind, body, and behavior of generations. This illustrates a chilling principle of power. Influence embedded in identity is nearly impossible to eradicate. Laws can be rewritten, social structures can be upended, and buildings can crumble. But a system that shapes perception and instinct persists quietly, invisibly, and with ruthless efficiency. The widow's experiment proves that mastery over people does not require violence, money, or public authority. It requires understanding, subtlety, and patience. By teaching obedience as identity, she created a framework that could replicate itself indefinitely. Now, as you follow this descent, ask yourself, how often do invisible forces shape behavior around you? Where do loyalty, obedience, or fear operate quietly, guiding choices without conscious awareness? These are the structures of power that endure, silently molding generations and shaping societies far beyond the reach of law or history books. Recognizing them is dangerous knowledge because once seen, you cannot ignore them. Understand this clearly. The widow's influence did not end with her death. It spread, it adapted, and it endured. What began as a horrifying experiment on a single plantation became a template for understanding how systems of control propagate through time. Hidden, invisible, and nearly impossible to dismantle. This is the true power of her legacy. And once you see it, your understanding of history, society, and human behavior is forever altered. By the 1970s, the widow's plantation had vanished from maps and memory. Yet the system she had engineered continued to thrive, not in buildings or soil, but in minds, instincts, and behaviors. Her sons had long since become architects of influence in their own right, teaching through example rather than instruction, enforcing obedience without a word, and ensuring loyalty through subtle reinforcement. They had mastered a principle their mother had understood decades earlier. Control embedded in identity is stronger than chains, more enduring than law, and invisible to those who live within it. The descendants of her seedlings had become carriers of a psychological blueprint. Across towns, communities, and families, habits, instincts, and perceptions shaped behavior quietly, invisibly, almost imperceptibly. They lived as though free, but their choices, alliances, and hierarchies were informed by decades of invisible conditioning. It was a legacy of manipulation that transcended bloodlines, extending its reach wherever her lessons had taken root. In every subtle glance, in every instinctive act of obedience or defiance, the architecture of her influence persisted. This is the ultimate lesson of her story. True power is rarely seen. It is felt, internalized, and perpetuated. The widow's experiment proves that systems of control survive when they operate beneath consciousness, shaping perception, behavior, and identity. Physical force, legal authority, or wealth is temporary. Influence embedded in the mind is almost immortal. It persists through generations, often unrecognized by those who carry it. Yet it determines the structures of loyalty, hierarchy, and obedience that govern society. As you reflect on this descent, understand that the widow's legacy is not merely a historical footnote. It is a lens through which to see power itself. Invisible, subtle, and persistent, it shapes decisions, molds relationships, and defines social structures. The plantation was just a laboratory. The experiment was eternal. By tracing it, you begin to see the hidden mechanics of control that operate all around you, within institutions, families, corporations, and governments. And now, as the final step in this journey, recognize what you have learned. You have glimpsed the architecture of invisible influence, the mechanics of internalized control, and the way power can endure across generations without being noticed. This knowledge is dangerous because it cannot be unseen. Once understood, it changes how you see authority, loyalty, and freedom forever. The widow's experiment is complete, but its lessons live on, silently guiding the world, waiting for those who have the eyes to recognize it.